I create dark, extreme horror stories, and for just $1, you can help me keep the horror alive. It's like buying me a terrifying cup of coffee to fuel the next gruesome tale. If you'd like to support, kindly donate. My PayPal link is in the description. The mirror arrived on a dreary, storm-ravaged night, its antique frame carved with grotesque, unearthly figures writhing in silent agony. Delivered to an isolated mansion far from prying eyes, it was exactly the type of curiosity that Nicholas liked to collect. An aristocrat with a penchant for the macabre, he had heard the whispered rumors that surrounded the relic. Some said it had been forged in a forgotten age by a madman obsessed with capturing the souls of the damned. Others swore it was a portal to a darker realm, one where reflection and reality twisted together until one devoured the other. He had thought these stories nothing but old-world superstitions, until the night he first laid eyes on the cursed glass. Nicholas set the mirror in the grand hall, the only room large enough to hold its imposing presence. At nearly 7 feet tall, the mirror seemed alive in its cold stillness. The dark wooden frame was almost black, etched with scenes of agony, bodies twisted in torment, faces contorted in eternal screams. Yet, the glass itself was pristine, too pristine for something so ancient. It reflected the candlelight with an unnatural sharpness, casting the flickering flames back at him with an eerie, almost mocking clarity. The housekeeper, an old woman named Agnes, had refused to touch it, muttering prayers under her breath as she crossed herself. "Bad omen, that thing," she said, her voice a low rasp. "Some objects are meant to stay lost." Nicholas, amused by her fear, dismissed her warnings with a wave. "Nonsense, Agnes. It's just a mirror. Nothing more." But even as he spoke, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine, as if the air around him had suddenly turned frigid. That night, as the storm raged outside, Nicholas stood alone before the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, as expected. But something was different. The eyes of his reflection gleamed with a subtle malevolence, a darkness that leaned in closer, squinting at the glass. His reflection leaned forward too, mimicking his movements, but then, in an instant, it twisted, the face in the mirror distorted, the skin pulling tight over sharp bones, the mouth curling into a grotesque grin. Nicholas stumbled back, blinking, his heart racing. For a moment, the image held, a twisted, skeletal version of himself, staring at him with eyes full of cruelty and hate. Then, as if mocking him, the reflection smoothed out, returning to normal. He let out a shaky breath, chuckling to himself. "Just a trick of the light," he muttered. But the unease stayed with him long after he left the hall. That night, sleep evaded Nicholas. He tossed and turned in his grand, four-poster bed, haunted by the reflection he'd seen. His dreams were filled with the mirror, its surface warping and twisting, revealing horrors that clawed at his mind. He dreamed of being trapped inside it, his body a puppet controlled by some unseen force. In the early hours of the morning, he awoke drenched in sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a long moment, he sat there in the dark, listening to the rain pounding against the windows, his heart racing. Then came the voice, a whisper, soft and sinister, echoing through the empty halls of the mansion. "Look again." Nicholas's blood turned to ice. He sat up in bed, straining to listen. The voice came again, clearer this time, a female voice full of menace. "Look into the mirror, Nicholas." He stumbled out of bed, grabbing a candle. His pulse hammered in his ears as he made his way down the winding staircase toward the grand hall. The mirror awaited him, its surface gleaming with unnatural light even in the darkness. It was as if the glass was calling him. Without thinking, he stepped toward it, raising the candle to its surface. His reflection stared back, but not as himself. This time, the image was a twisted, horrifying version of him, eyes sunken deep into his skull. Blood dripped from his mouth, and his hands were stained red, the skin on his knuckles torn and bloody. He looked like a monster, a beast that had crawled out of some forgotten nightmare. Nicholas gasped, stumbling backward, the candle slipping from his grip and crashing to the floor. He blinked, desperate to wake up from the nightmare, but the image remained. The reflection raised a hand, reaching for him through the glass, and then it smiled. Each day, Nicholas found himself drawn back to the mirror, even as the horrors it revealed grew more grotesque. His reflection was no longer a reflection. It had become something other, something alive, mocking him from the other side of the glass. The images it showed him were unspeakable, visions of torture, mutilation, and death. He saw himself committing acts of violence beyond comprehension, ripping the flesh from bone, bathing in the blood of his victims, laughing as he slaughtered them, and yet, every time he turned away, the darkness followed him. He could feel it in the walls of the mansion, creeping into his mind, whispering to him in the dead of night. By the fourth day, Nicholas had stopped eating. His eyes were sunken, and his skin had taken on a sickly pallor. He barely slept, haunted by the nightmares the mirror had infected him with. In his waking hours, he began to hear the voices more frequently, whispers echoing through the empty mansion, urging him to return to the glass. "Your soul belongs to me." The voice hissed one night, its words slithering into his mind. On the seventh night, Nicholas stood before the mirror for what he knew would be the last time. His reflection was no longer twisted, it had become a grotesque, demonic version of him, its body covered in blood and scars, eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. But now, there was something else in the reflection, a woman. She stood behind him, her face a mask of pain and fury, her eyes pinned to his skull. Blood dripped from his mouth, and his hands were stained red, the skin on his knuckles torn and bloody. He looked like a monster, a beast that had crawled out of some forgotten nightmare. Nicholas gasped, stumbling backward, the candle slipping from his grip and crashing to the floor. He blinked, desperate to wake up from the nightmare, but the image remained. The reflection raised a hand, reaching for him through the glass, and then it smiled. Each day, Nicholas found himself drawn back to the mirror, even as the horrors it revealed grew more grotesque. His reflection was no longer a reflection. It had become something other, something alive, mocking him from the other side of the glass. The images it showed him were unspeakable, visions of torture, mutilation, and death. He saw himself committing acts of violence beyond comprehension, ripping the flesh from bone, bathing in the blood of his victims, laughing as he slaughtered them, and yet, every time he turned away, the darkness followed him. He could feel it in the walls of the mansion, creeping into his mind, whispering to him in the dead of night. By the fourth day, Nicholas had stopped eating. His eyes were sunken, and his skin had taken on a sickly pallor. He barely slept, haunted by the nightmares the mirror had infected him with. In his waking hours, he began to hear the voices more frequently, whispers echoing through the empty mansion, urging him to return to the glass. "Your soul belongs to me." The voice hissed one night, its words slithering into his mind. On the seventh night, Nicholas stood before the mirror for what he knew would be the last time. His reflection was no longer twisted, it had become a grotesque, demonic version of him, its body covered in blood and scars, eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. But now, there was something else in the reflection, a woman. She stood behind him, her face a mask of pain and fury, her eye, but Nicholas could hear her words in his mind, "You will suffer as I did." Before he could react, she lunged forward, her hands reaching through the glass, her fingers wrapping around his throat. Nicholas gasped, clawing at his neck as the reflection of the woman began to pull him into the mirror. He could feel the cold glass pressing against his skin, his body being dragged into the cursed realm beyond. With a final scream, Nicholas was pulled into the mirror, his body vanishing into the twisted reflection. The mansion fell silent once more. Weeks later, the mansion was sold to a new owner. The mirror remained, a silent witness to the horrors it had caused. The new owner, curious about the ancient relic, stood before it, admiring its craftsmanship. For a moment, they thought they saw a flicker in the glass, a brief, twisted smile on the face of the reflection. The mansion remained dormant for a few months after Nicholas's disappearance, a silent tomb housing forgotten memories. His fate became a hushed rumor, his mansion left unsold until it caught the eye of Eleanor Price. A renowned historian and collector of rare artifacts, Eleanor had been fascinated by the legends surrounding the house, particularly the infamous mirror. She arrived one overcast afternoon, her heart racing with anticipation. The air felt unnaturally cold as she stepped inside, her heels echoing in the empty halls. Dust clung to everything, but the house was still grand, a relic of another time. What caught her eye immediately was the mirror, standing in the grand hall like a dark sentinel. It seemed almost alive, its surface gleaming even in the dim light of the cloudy day. She could feel it pulling her in, its presence palpable, but she shook off the feeling. Stories were just that, stories. Eleanor ordered the house cleaned and repaired, but one instruction was clear: the mirror was to remain. After the workers had gone, Eleanor sat in the study, reading through Nicholas's journals. They were incoherent, rambling accounts of madness, fear, and obsession with the mirror. He wrote of seeing things, terrible things, within its depths. He described his reflection as a separate entity, something malevolent that wished to consume him. As she read, a chill crept over her skin. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the mansion, a faint whisper, barely audible. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding. She strained to listen, her breath shallow, look into the mirror. The voice was soft, feminine, filled with a seductive darkness. It drifted through the empty hallways like a breeze. Unsettling and unnatural. Eleanor shook her head, convincing herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her after reading the unsettling journals, but the voice persisted. Compelled by a force she couldn't explain, Eleanor rose from her chair and made her way to the grand hall, where the mirror loomed in the darkness. The room felt oppressive, the air thick with something unseen. She stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection. For a moment, everything seemed normal, just her pale face staring back at her, the dim light of the hall casting shadows over her features. But then, it changed. Her reflection smiled. Eleanor took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. The smile twisted into something grotesque, the mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellow teeth. Her reflection's eyes darkened, the pupils expanding until they were nothing but black voids. "Don't look away," the reflection whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Eleanor's legs buckled, and she stumbled back, gasping. Her reflection mimicked her movements but continued to smile, the face now twisted into something monstrous, skin sagging, bones jutting out at unnatural angles. Blood began to drip from the corners and her voice echoing through the mansion as she ran from the hall, slamming the door behind her. The next day, Eleanor tried to shake off the experience. Exhaustion, stress, it was all in her mind. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The mansion felt different now, the air heavier, darker. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. That night, the dreams began. Eleanor found herself standing in front of the mirror again, but this time, she was inside the reflection. The room was reversed, everything slightly distorted. She couldn't move, her body paralyzed as her reflection smiled at her, stepping forward. It raised a hand, fingers long and twisted, nails sharp like claws. With a sudden, violent motion, it grabbed her throat, squeezing hard. Eleanor tried to scream, but no sound came out. She could feel her windpipe collapsing under the pressure, blood filling her mouth as the reflection dragged her closer, its eyes glowing with hunger. She woke up choking, clawing at her neck, gasping for air. The nightmare lingered in her mind, vivid and horrifying. Her throat ached, as if the dream had been real, but what truly terrified her was the mark, an angry, red bruise around her neck, exactly where the reflection had grabbed her. Eleanor knew she needed help. She reached out to an old friend, Dr. David Marlowe, a parapsychologist who specialized in the occult. He arrived the next evening, his skepticism masked by genuine concern for Eleanor's well-being. "This mirror," he said, examining it closely, "it's old, very old. The carvings are disturbing. They resemble ancient symbols used in rituals, possibly to trap spirits or even souls." Eleanor swallowed hard. "You think Nicholas was right? That it's cursed?" David looked at her seriously. "I've seen things, Eleanor. I've studied cursed objects. Whatever is in this mirror is not just a spirit, it's something far darker, far more dangerous." As they spoke, the air around them grew colder. A low hum began to vibrate through the floor, barely perceptible but enough to make the hairs on the back of Eleanor's neck stand on end. David moved toward the mirror, his breath fogging the glass as he approached. Suddenly, his reflection shifted. It grinned at him, a sharp, menacing smile. David stepped back, but the reflection didn't move with him. It stayed close to the glass, its eyes locked on him. Without warning, the reflection smashed its fist against the glass from the other side. The sound was deafening, and a spiderweb of cracks appeared across the surface, though the mirror itself remained intact. David staggered back, horrified. "It's feeding," he whispered, his face pale. "It wants us." The next few days were a blur of terror and paranoia. Eleanor and David tried to leave the mansion, but no matter how far they went, something always pulled them back. The roads would twist, the mansion reappearing like a dark shadow on the horizon, trapping them in its cursed grip. Inside, the mirror's power grew stronger. Eleanor began to see things that weren't there, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, voices calling to her from empty rooms. The mansion had become a prison, and the mirror was the warden. But the worst came that night. Eleanor had barely slept, her mind unraveling under the constant assault of nightmares and whispers. She stood in the grand hall once more, staring at the cracked surface of the mirror. Her reflection grinned at her again, but this time, it wasn't alone. Behind her, in the reflection, stood Nicholas. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes wide with terror, his throat slashed open, blood pouring down his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a gurgling, wet sound. Eleanor screamed, spinning around, but they turned back to the mirror. Nicholas was gone, replaced by the woman. Her eyes burned with hatred as she whispered, "You're next." David tried one last time to break the curse, performing an ancient ritual he had discovered in his research. He chanted words in a language Eleanor couldn't understand, lighting candles around the mirror, desperate to banish whatever evil inhabited the glass. But it was too late. The mirror shattered with an ear-splitting crack, pieces of glass flying across the room. For a moment, Eleanor thought they had succeeded. But then the pieces began to move, twisting and writhing on the floor like living things. From the shards, dark figures began to emerge, twisted, monstrous versions of themselves. Eleanor and David could only watch in horror as their reflections crawled out of the broken mirror, their eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. The room filled with screams as the mirror claimed its final victims. Months later, the mansion was sold once again, this time to an unsuspecting family. The mirror had been repaired, its surface gleaming with an unnatural light. On the first night in the mansion, the new owner stood before the mirror, admiring its craftsmanship. For a moment, they thought they saw something in the reflection, a figure, watching them from within the glass. Back to the mirror, Nicholas was gone, replaced by the woman. Her eyes burned with hatred as she whispered, "You're next." David tried one last time to break the curse, performing an ancient ritual he had discovered in his research. He chanted words in a language Eleanor couldn't understand, lighting candles around the mirror, desperate to banish whatever evil inhabited the glass. But it was too late. The mirror shattered with an ear-splitting crack, pieces of glass flying across the room. For a moment, Eleanor thought they had succeeded. But then the pieces began to move, twisting and writhing on the floor like living things. From the shards, dark figures began to emerge, twisted. Monstrous versions of themselves. Eleanor and David could only watch in horror as their reflections crawled out of the broken mirror, their eyes glowing with malevolent hunger, the room filled with screams as the mirror claimed its final victims. Months later, the mansion was sold once again, this time to an unsuspecting family. The mirror had been repaired, its surface gleaming with an unnatural light. On the first night in the mansion, the new owner stood before the mirror, admiring its craftsmanship. For a moment, they thought they saw something in the reflection, a figure, watching them from within the glass. Came, slithering into his mind like poison. Look into the mirror. Daniel didn't sleep for the rest of the night, but when morning came, he told no one about what he had seen. He couldn't explain it, and the words seemed to die on his lips whenever he tried. But the mirror haunted his thoughts. That day, while the rest of the family unpacked and settled into their new home, Daniel wandered the halls. The house seemed darker, the walls pressing in on him with each step. He found himself drawn to the grand hall, where the mirror loomed. He stood before it, staring at his reflection. For a moment, everything was normal, his own face looking back at him, pale and wide-eyed. But then the reflection changed. His mouth twisted into a grin that wasn't his own, his eyes darkened, and a stream of blood began to pour from his nose, staining his shirt crimson. Daniel stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He blinked, and the vision was gone. His reflection was normal again, but the image of himself bleeding, grinning maniacally, was burned into his mind. He ran out of the hall, the voice whispering in his ear, "It wants you." Melissa had always been skeptical of the supernatural. She was pragmatic, grounded in reality, and didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But as the second night fell, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to the mansion. The air felt too still, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the flickering candlelight. Richard was away on a business trip, leaving Melissa alone with the children. After putting them to bed, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the living room, trying to unwind. The fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room, but then the temperature dropped. The warmth of the fire was suddenly swallowed by a bone-chilling cold. Melissa's breath fogged in front of her, and a prickling sensation like someone whispering her name drifted from the hallway. "Richard?" She called out, knowing full well he wasn't there. Her voice trembled slightly. The whisper came again, closer this time. Her heart began to race as she stood, clutching the wine glass in her hand like a makeshift weapon. She crept toward the grand hall, drawn inexplicably to the mirror. When she stepped into the room, the air seemed to hum with electricity. The mirror reflected her pale face, wide-eyed and terrified. She saw movement behind her, a shadow shifting in the dim light. Melissa spun around, but the hall was empty. Suddenly, her reflection began to change. Her face contorted, her skin peeling away to reveal rotting flesh beneath. Blood dripped from her mouth as her eyes rolled back in her head, leaving only white, soulless orbs. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The reflection grinned at her, a guttural voice filling her mind. "You're mine now." Melissa stumbled backward, dropping the wine glass, which shattered on the floor. Her reflection reached out, clawing at the glass as if trying to break free. With a scream, Melissa ran from the room, the mirror's laughter echoing in her ears. Richard returned the next morning, his trip cut short after a strange and unsettling phone call from Melissa. She had sounded frantic, her words incoherent, begging him to come home. When he arrived, he found her pale and trembling. Sitting at the kitchen table, clutching a mug of cold coffee. "There's something wrong with this house," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The mirror. It's cursed." Richard frowned, sitting down beside her. "Melissa, you've been under a lot of stress. Moving is hard." "No," she snapped, her eyes wild. "You don't understand. I saw something. Something horrible. It was me, but not me. It wants to hurt us, Richard." Richard tried to comfort her, but deep down, unease gnawed at him. He had always been rational, but the stories about the mansion, the strange occurrences, there was a part of him that couldn't dismiss them. That night, as the family sat down for dinner, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Daniel was quiet, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. Emily picked at her food, her normally cheerful demeanor replaced by a strange, distant silence. Halfway through the meal, the lights flickered. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. Melissa gasped, clutching Richard's arm as the children huddled together. And then the whisper came, louder this time, "Come to me." Richard grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made his way toward the circuit breaker, determined to fix the power outage. But as he walked through the mansion, the shadows seemed to move, twisting and writhing along the walls like living things. The air was thick with dread, and Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The flashlight flickered, casting brief, erratic beams of light across the hallways. He reached the grand hall, where the mirror loomed, its dark surface reflecting nothing but darkness. The flashlight flickered again and went out. For a moment, Richard stood frozen, his breath shallow. Then the whisper came again, louder, more insistent, "Look into the mirror." Unable to resist, Richard turned toward the mirror. His reflection was barely visible in the darkness, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw something horrifying. It wasn't him in the reflection. It was a twisted, monstrous version of himself, eyes glowing with malevolent light, skin stretched tight over bones, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The reflection moved, stepping closer to the glass, raising a hand as if to reach through and drag. Richard stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned and ran, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the mansion as the mirror's hold tightened around the house. By the fourth day, the mansion had become a living nightmare. The mirror's influence was everywhere. Every corner of the house seemed to breathe with dark energy, the walls whispering secrets in a language none of them understood. The Harrisons were trapped, their once idyllic life now a twisted nightmare of terror and paranoia. Melissa's mind began to unravel, her sanity slipping away with each passing hour. She heard voices constantly, felt the cold grip of invisible hands on her skin. Emily became withdrawn, staring at the mirror for hours on end, her eyes wide and unblinking. And Daniel. Daniel had stopped speaking altogether. Richard knew they had to leave, but every time they tried, the roads would twist and turn, leading them back to the mansion. It was as if the house had swallowed them whole, trapping them in its cursed embrace. That night, Richard made a decision. He was going to destroy the mirror. He grabbed a hammer from the garage and made his way to the grand hall. The house seemed to groan around him, the air thick with malevolent energy. Richard gripped the hammer tightly, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the mansion watching him, its ancient walls breathing with a sinister presence that seemed to throb in the silence. The grand hall was colder than the rest of the house, a frozen tomb where the cursed mirror loomed like a malevolent deity. The glass shimmered in the dim light, the twisted reflection of the room within barely visible. Richard's reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed, its mouth curling into a grotesque smile that didn't belong to him. The hammer felt heavy in his hands, but his determination to break free from the mirror's grip outweighed the fear. Doorway, her face gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. "Richard. Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It won't let you destroy it. It will take you." I have to try," Richard said, cutting her off. "This thing is tearing us apart. If we don't stop it now, we're going to die here." Melissa backed away, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking. "You don't understand. It's not just the mirror, it's the house. It's all connected. We can't escape." Ignoring her words, Richard raised the hammer high and brought it down with all his strength. The glass didn't shatter. Instead, the mirror let out an ear-piercing shriek that reverberated through the mansion like a scream from the bowels of hell. Richard staggered back, dropping the hammer as the reflection in the glass began to ripple, warping into something even more monstrous. His reflection morphed into a hideous creature, a twisted version of himself, with elongated limbs and a grotesque, leering face. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural, blood-red light as it reached out from the glass, clawing at the surface. Richard backed away, his heart pounding in his chest as the creature's hand punched through the glass. Shards flew everywhere, slicing through the air like razors, but none of them struck him. The mirror was pulling the beast from its depths, birthing it into the real world. "No!" Richard screamed, scrambling to his feet. But it was too late. The creature was halfway out, its body contorting unnaturally as it crawled free from the mirror, its skin a sickly shade of gray, its mouth full of jagged, rotting teeth. Behind him, Melissa screamed. The creature lunged forward, its claws tearing into the wooden floor as it dragged itself toward Richard. He ran, his footsteps echoing in the cold, empty halls of the mansion. The mansion itself seemed to come alive, groaning and shifting as the creature pursued Richard through its labyrinth, pulsate with dark energy, bleeding shadows that reached out like tendrils, grasping at him as he ran. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on him. Richard could hear the others screaming, the children's terrified cries echoing from somewhere deep within the mansion. He tried to reach them, but every hallway twisted back on itself, leading him in circles. No matter where he turned, the creature's rasping breath was always right behind him. Finally, he stumbled into the basement, the only place left to hide. The air down here was colder, more suffocating. Richard knew he had made a mistake, but there was no turning back now. He had to face whatever this curse was head-on. The basement was a cavernous, forgotten place, filled with dust-covered relics and old furniture that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. In the center of the room, an ancient altar stood, something far older than the mansion itself. The stone surface was stained dark with the blood of long-forgotten rituals. Richard's eyes locked onto the object sitting atop the altar, another mirror, smaller, older, more cracked, but unmistakably connected to the cursed one upstairs. The origins of the curse lay here, in the bowels of the mansion. Behind him, the creature crawled into the room, its body hunched and twisted, its eyes glowing with hunger. Richard backed up against the altar, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced. How could he stop this? The answer came to him in a flash of clarity. The curse had begun here. It had to end here. Richard grabbed the smaller mirror, lifting it high above his head. The creature hissed, shrinking back as if the mirror repelled it. "I know what you are," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "I know what you want." The creature snarled, but it didn't move any closer. Its glowing eyes flicked between Richard and the mirror in his hands, sensing its vulnerability. He could feel the weight of the centuries-old curse pressing down on him, the darkness that had consumed countless souls before him. With a scream of defiance, Richard hurled the smaller mirror to the ground, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The effect was immediate. The creature let out a bone-rattling scream, its body convulsing as the curse unraveled. The walls of the mansion shook violently, cracks splintering through the foundation as the very fabric of reality began to tear. but something was wrong. Instead of dissipating, the shadows in the room began to pool together, swirling around Richard like a vortex. The curse wasn't lifting, it was shifting, changing. The destruction of the mirror hadn't freed them, it had unleashed something far worse. The creature lunged at Richard one final time, and as its claws raked across his chest, a blinding light filled the room. He screamed, the pain unbearable, as the mirror's curse latched onto him, pulling him into its nightmarish realm. When Richard opened his eyes, he was standing in the grand hall again, the mansion eerily silent. The mirror stood before him, whole once more, its surface as smooth and dark as ever, but something was different. His reflection no longer moved with him. Instead, it stood still, watching him with cold, lifeless eyes. And then, slowly, it smiled, a wicked, knowing smile. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. He was trapped. He was no longer the man in the real world. He was now the reflection. On the other side of the glass, the creature that had once been his reflection now walked free, inhabiting his body, living his life. Richard screamed, pounding on the inside of the mirror, but no sound escaped. The house had a new guardian, a new soul to feed on. The curse had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. Days passed. The Harrisons were the mansion went back on the market. A real estate agent showed the property to a new family, an unsuspecting couple eager to make a fresh start in the quiet countryside. They marveled at the house's grandeur, its ancient beauty, and in the grand hall, the mirror stood waiting. As the new owner gazed into its depths, his reflection smiled. The curse was far from over.